Hi, welcome back, everyone. This is your friend Greedy Fanfics, bringing you another fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the fourth part of What If Deku Had a Super Copy Quirk. All credit for this story goes to December King, so please support them by checking out the link in the description for more details. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more content like this. Now, let's get into the fanfic. Given the fact that one of Midoriya's clones had still been in the dorms with them while the original was MIA, it was still kind of shocking to see Midoriya walking around. Especially since his behavior was so radically different from what they were used to. While he still had his sunny smile, his intelligence, and his heroic fanaticism, a lot of his mannerisms had changed. For one thing, he no longer muttered his thoughts out loud. This actually caused a lot of frustration during a certain incident that happened shortly after their return. Mina had been experimenting with her quirk and had accidentally dosed herself with a rather large amount of hallucinogens. Rather than figuring out a solution via muttering, he simply created a warp gate to Recovery Girl's office. Another thing that had changed was how he slept. He usually pulled all-nighters at least once every 2 weeks, but now it was twice a week. And on top of that, when he did sleep, he had started sleepwalking and babbling. Some of what he said was identifiable language, which Aoyama revealed when he translated a French phrase Midoriya had said while sleep-deprived. But a lot of other things were not as easily translated. He sometimes spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, and even fucking Sumerian one time. Still, they were happy to have Mito back. He had already started to help them out with minor problems. For instance, he had used overhaul on Oyama to help account for his stomachaches, as well as sparring with his classmates one-on-one to help them get better with their quirks. That was another thing that they were busy dealing with. Being in contact with the full power of One for All, even if only for a few moments, had turned out to be enough to strengthen and or alter the mechanics several of their quirks. Bakugo's explosions were now rainbow-colored and noticeably more compressed, while Uraraka was now able to manipulate the gravity of objects under her quirk without using her fingers, as well as being able to spread the effects. Ojiro was busy learning how to shift the shape of his tail and use it as a weapon, while Hagakure was working on controlling her light refraction field. It had been several days since Operation Troy had gone down, with the UA faculty and HPSC doing their job diligently during that time. They had not had normal classes, instead being assigned packets of homework for each of their subjects. No one complained though, given that they had just been involved in a major war for the soul of Japan. Eventually though, their teachers returned, immediately calling for a meeting with classes 2A and 2B. Nizu was astonished by what he'd learned from that meeting. Acquiring All for One had pushed him to true singularity level, and the combination of quirks he had sent him backwards in time to about 10,000 BC. Hearing just the broad strokes of what his personal student had been doing for all of that time was insane. He had been accused of having a god complex, but now he could definitively point at someone and say truthfully that they were God. Midoriya had been guiding humanity into the future, directly intervening in human history for millennia as its guardian and protector. To hear that he was the fabled Monkey King, the demigod Gilgamesh, and the father of Jesus was a lot to take in. Though it did make sense, a singularity-level person with dozens of quirks in the age before quirks would be seen as not just a god, but the god. The amount of historical knowledge he spouted from off the top of his head was completely ridiculous. Midoriya had revealed the truth behind President Kennedy's assassination, as well as admitting to being the primary funder for all manned missions to the moon, even visiting it himself. He even confessed to being the one to have created quirks, proving overhaul right by using rats and viruses as a medium to change humanity and grant them superhuman powers. And as if all of that wasn't fucking enough, the boy had pulled out a 20 PB flash drive, 2,048,000 terabytes, filled with data he had collected throughout the millennia, with detailed notes on essentially every historical person of interest, as well as the plans and floor layout for every building of interest to them. The files he had on the commission had Niza salivating, knowing that even 1% of that was enough to incriminate all of their current employees. But most terrifying was the reveal of the Commission's bioengineering department. Yagi had vomited at the revelation that his good friend Mirai's DNA had been used to create a child, especially at the fact that it was also related to one of his students. After all of that, ᴄᴟ had pretty much zoned out. Right now, what he needed was a glass of whiskey. True, he may prefer tea, but on occasion, he did need something stronger. Though the fact he hadn't needed it at Kamino was quite telling of how crazy the situation was. ᴄᴟ groaned again as he walked into the support course, seeing Midoriya deep in conversation with Hatsum while holding a wooden cup. He had almost managed to repress the fact that the boy's son had been the literal founder of Christianity, but the sight of that cup brought it roaring back. "Midoriya," he began sternly. "Is that the goddamn Holy Grail?" Midoriya smiled in a way that was too much like his own grin for his comfort. "Why, yes, sir. It is the me-damn Holy Grail. I was talking with May to see if we can replicate its healing powers." That gave him pause. Given what Midoriya had said about his son having multiple regeneration quirks, and what was held to be true about the Holy Grail, it stood to reason that this could be a massive medical advance. He was about to greenlight the project, when he noticed a certain golden ark with cherubim on it. "You are not going to weaponize the Ark of the Covenant, are you, young Hatsum?" he asked dangerously. The support course second year shuddered, before shaking her head. "Then you should be fine for now. Just know that I'll be watching the both of you very closely from now on." ᴄᴟ turned and left the support lab, heading for his office for another cup of whiskey. It may be 10 in the morning, but Aizawa was right about one thing: Midoriya was the problem child. Fortunately enough, Midoriya was soon back to normal, his chaotic tendencies now dialed back to a level that the faculty could handle. He was now the exact same sunshine boy with godlike power that they were used to living with, and it looked like everything would be going well at UA for the foreseeable future. The Commission had, of course, tried to make several moves while the country was still in recovery mode from the Paranormal Liberation War, which though short had been extremely devastating. Since many members of the faculty were heroes involved in the cleanup of Japan, the HPSC had tried to get temporary substitutes to teach at schools across the country. ᴄᴟ had naturally seen right through the offer and point-blank denied their offer, knowing full well that they were trying to get access to his private files. Instead, he had pulled the faculty back from frontline duty, explaining that he hoped the top 10 heroes would be able to pick up the slack. That was not the only move that they were making, of course. Monoma had revealed that he'd been contacted again by the same commission agent who had tried to recruit him as a spy within UA, and confirmed that they were still trying to get access to Midoriya's DNA. And through some of his own moles within the commission, he knew that they were planning to try and manipulate young Oyama into being a mole within UA by leveraging the fact that he'd worked with the League, pointedly ignoring that it had been under coercion. Of course, he knew that none of that was likely to work. He had taken the Aoyama family under his wing and placed them in a safe house. And the combined influence of the symbol of peace as well as the current number 1 and number 2 testifying to his crucial role in taking down the leadership of the Liberation Front would remove all doubt from the minds of the public as to Can't Stop Twinkling's true loyalty. But other than the Commission's renewed attempts to get one over on him in their decades-long Cold War, things were peaceful. The rank and file of the Paranormal Liberation Front had been easily rounded up for the most part by one-for-all wielding doubles working alongside the pros, anonymously, of course, while his contacts overseas reported that the vast surging of the criminal underworld caused by the Front's declaration of war had subsided, and most of those involved had been captured and charged. Overall, for all the destruction caused by the Paranormal Liberation War, it had been ended pretty decisively, with all of the higher-ups being captured. The only one still at large was their technical expert, Skeptic, who had been captured by Team Pyrofrost at Kamino, but had managed to escape somehow during the last stages of the battle against Shigaraki. Outside of managing UA, his primary concern right now was helping to rebuild Japan. And one of the first priorities of the reconstruction effort was rebuilding Tartarus. Their go-to super prison had been effortlessly destroyed by Tamura Shigaraki, who had then recruited hundreds of hardened criminals to join his cause. And while most of them had been recaptured, they along with the key members from the defeated liberation warriors needed a place where they could be safely incarcerated. It had already been decided that they would be reusing the same island as the original Tartarus that had been destroyed, but plans for how exactly the new prison would be built so they could improve upon its predecessor were not exactly forthcoming. One option had been to simply construct another prison with dedicated heroes on site to defend it. Such heroes would naturally have abilities suited to thwart attacks on the prison complex, or to prevent escapes. And while that idea was somewhat tempting, ᴡᴜ personally had a different plan. He and Midoriya had been busy contemplating the concept of an underwater prison, which would naturally make any attempt at escape extremely difficult. For one thing, it protected against the key weakness that had brought Tartarus down. Decay could only affect solids. And while decay itself was no longer an issue, it was not unlikely that similar quirks might come into being. There were other safeguards in place, of course. They would naturally make sure to counter the use of aquatic mutant quirks, as well as hydrokinetic quirks, as those would allow any villain with a brain to be able to get into the facility with ease. Warping quirks would also be of particular interest, because though they only knew of 3 at the moment, it wouldn't be too outlandish for a villain to have one. One idea that had been suggested was the use of the Marianas Trench as the site of the new prison. That was one idea that certainly had merit, as it was difficult to access, though it required quite a large amount of technical work to ensure it would function. For one thing, they would need to make sure that the exterior of the prison would be able to resist the pressures of being so deep in the ocean. And for another, they would also need to be able to prevent the use of quirks entirely in order to prevent any holes from being made in the prison's hull. Third was of course the natural environmental concerns of building in such a unique ecosystem. ᴡᴜ's compassion for his fellow animals and his desire to incarcerate these criminals as far away as possible were at war, and he was struggling to resolve that conflict. Regardless, it had been agreed that they would put a marker on the site of the old prison commemorating those who lost their lives to Shigaraki and the Monoma on that day. Everyone agreed that the fallen deserved as much, and the living owed them a debt that only that much could repay. Though no one was able to agree about what to do with the site beyond the memorial itself. Personally, ᴡᴜ wanted to use it as an entrance to the new prison, hopefully utilizing a technological equivalent of a warping quirk to allow for access. But that would take quite a lot of work from the support course, even for their rising star ᴡᴜ with her recently patented quirk replicating technology. But all of that would take far too much time and effort for them to be able to hold the prisoners, so they would probably need a temporary holding facility to keep them contained while the new complex was designed and built. Enji grunted in exhaustion. Every day since the end of the war had been absolutely exhausting for him, mopping up the remnants of the Liberation Front and dealing with various other criminal groups that had flourished in the wartime environment. And on top of all that, he still had to attend long and in-depth press conferences to reassure the citizens that things were slowly but surely getting back to normal. He thanked whatever deity was watching over them for making All Might and Midoriya. Honestly, without the two of them helping to ease things up, there would be no way that Japan could have recovered so fast. With All Might using his growing influence as the continuing symbol of peace and Midoriya using the vast arsenal of quirks at his disposal, they had been able to go from a full wartime footing back to ordinary peacetime footing in less than a week. And even if the pros were ever so slightly overworked dealing with all of the various criminals and villains that had come out of the woodwork during the war, it was nowhere near as bad as it had been during the few weeks that the Liberation Front had been on the move. Fortunately, since things were clearing up, soon he would be able to finally come clean to the public about his misdeeds. It had hurt him to see his adoring fans deny Dabi's revelations, when he knew that they were completely true. He would set the record straight and make clear his desire to atone for his sins in the eyes of all, no matter how long it would take. Of course, he had more reasons to confess than just a guilty conscience. ᴡᴜ had brought him up to speed on the many misdeeds of the Commission, and he was glad to help take down such a corrupt organization by spilling his secrets. All that the rodent-like principal asked was that he hint and imply that the Safety Commission was aware of his sins, and he would take care of the rest, turning it into an eventual media firestorm that would focus on the Commission. But for now, he still had more work to do today. Given Spinner's rhetoric about the mistreatment of heteromorphs, the Inhuman Supremacy Party had naturally flocked to his cause and began patrolling throughout Japan. And unfortunately, They consistently came into conflict with members of the creature rejection clan, leading to heavy bloodshed. Both groups had become more and more active since the end of the war, with the majority of civilian casualties from villain attacks being from fights between the two ideologically opposed groups. It had gotten so bad that several suspects had admitted to attacking and even killing those who showed mercy to the other side. Fortunately, neither of them were his current priority, that responsibility having been handed to Best Jeanist, who was leading a task force of heroes to quell these violent gang wars. His priority was being there as a tangible symbol of the victory of law and order. And to that end, he was scheduled to be present for a short ceremony later that day honoring the valor of the fallen guards of Tartarus. They deserved to be remembered for their heroism in standing against Shigaraki, even if they had not been able to match his power blow for blow. After all, not all heroes wore capes, and these guards had put their lives on the line to stop Shigaraki from recruiting the most twisted individuals in all of Japan to his banner. Tensei Ida smiled as he walked onto the grounds of UA. He had just finished his 5th day of patrols since his return to hero work, and he was here to see his little brother, and of course to thank Midoriya and Eri for healing him. He had no doubt that Tenya would be over the moon to see him in action. Who knows? Maybe he'd take his little bro out on a work study to learn the family business in a more personalized way. Eraserhead had sent him a copy of his brother's current schedule, along with a text stating that he was visiting the support course lab at the moment. He barely suppressed a shudder that came over him for reasons that he could not explain, before heading towards the engineering lab. Tensei knocked on the door, which opened soon enough to reveal a grime-covered engineer with pink dreadlocks and yellow crosshair eyes. She seemed to recognize him slightly, before turning back and yelling, "Hey Legs, your clone is here!" In a matter of moments Tenya was standing there, his mouth agape. Tensei mentally counted down, and right on schedule, his little brother began chopping his right arm enthusiastically while bowing. After a few seconds of this, he just walked up to his brother and hugged him tightly, a hug that Tenya reciprocated with equal force. "So, who's your friend?" he asked innocently. Surprisingly, Tenya blushed slightly. "This is ᴅᴇ'ʟ, my acquaintance from the support course. We met at the sports festival." The now-named Hatsum snickered to herself, about to recount how they had met, but Ingenium beat her to the punch. "Oh, so she's the one who tricked you in your first round?" Tenya gaped as he continued. "There wasn't much to watch while I was in recovery, other than reruns. Fortunately, I managed to see most of your matches, and I gotta say, I'm definitely impressed. If you think he was impressive there, you should see the things he's doing now," Hatsum chimed in. "I've had to change his hero costume so much in the past few months to keep up with him. He even helped beat Endeavor's son's ass." Tensei frowned at the mention of Dabi, not wanting to think about the number one's abusive past. But he continued talking amiably with the two of them, noticing his brother looking towards Hatsum in a very friendly way on the sly. And surprisingly, she also sent Tenya a few glances when he wasn't looking, winking at Tensei when she was caught. He chuckled under his breath, quietly wishing his brother luck in his love life. Hopefully having a significant other would help to chill him out just a little bit more. Honestly, this was heaven. After so many years spent in the past, being home with his mom and dad was enough of a reward for his centuries of hard work. His family being all together at last was absolute bliss for Izuku, and he didn't intend to miss a single moment of it. He had naturally asked the teachers if he could go back to his childhood home for the weekend, given that the dorms weren't needed as much now that the Liberation Front had been defeated and the Oyumas had gotten out from under All for One's thumb. Of course, they had given their permission, so he was spending his time with his mom and dad for the weekend, and would likely be moving back in with them soon enough. Inko was extremely proud of Izuku for single-handedly taking down the two greatest evils of their age, and working to take down a corrupt government agency. Though at the revelation of everything he had gone through in the past, she had briefly had a freak-out over the fact that she had technically been a grandmother. Especially the fact that she had been Jesus' grandmother. Honestly, though, he should have expected this after Shiozaki in Class B had been filled in on the situation by Monoma. She had started stalking him in a way that was unnervingly similar to Toga, which made sense, given how much of a religious nut she was. By contrast, his father Hisashi was more interested in the implications of his son being the creator of quirks, given that his paternal grandmother was the first quirked individual. The mention of the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy Grail had him frothing at the mouth at the thought of the possibilities. And the boxes and boxes of notebooks that Izuku had brought him with historical information about things that had always bothered him along with most other scholars definitely contributed to things. After all, discovering that your son had been part of the American Artemis III missions to the moon was not exactly something that happened every day. Despite the chaos and confusion regarding everything he managed to pull off in his long life, Izuku felt warm, knowing that his parents were so thoroughly proud of him. And he was only 16 at this point, so he had nowhere to go but up. Soon enough, he would become the #1 hero in the world, but maybe even of all time. In the secret council chamber of the Hero Public Safety Commission, the top brass met. The president passed out copies of a letter they had been sent from a known fugitive skeptic of the former Meta Liberation Army. Every one of them was up in arms discussing the contents of the letter, revealing certain information that Shigaraki had told him about the symbol of peace, as well as suspicions about his heritage from the double of Kyudaigarashi before Hawks destroyed him. If this information was true, then they would need to sanction Midoriya sooner than they had expected. After all, a descendant of All for One with post-singularity power and intelligence was not something they could let slide, even if he was a hero. And the thought of the power they sought, which they now knew to be called One for All, being in the hands of someone they couldn't control or manipulate was unbearable. Fortunately, they had the resources and the cunning to rectify these issues. Naomasa Tsukachi sighed in exhaustion. Considering his usual hours, and the surge in crime that had accompanied the resurgence of All for One and the emergence of his apprentice as a major player within Japan, this should not be surprising. But at this point, he was not really being assigned to cases, as he was technically on break for all of his hard work. Of course, that was just the official story. The full truth was that he was currently working as a major part of the UA faction's offensive against the Hero Commission, just like Yagi and Midoriya. There was a difference between what he was doing and what his old friend and his successor were doing. While the wielders of One for All were busy holding the fabric of society together as Japan rebuilt, simultaneously setting up plans that would keep the commission off balance, Tsukachi had been tapped by Nisa to be the effective head of the group of heroes, officers, public officials and lawyers concerned with orchestrating the final blow. If they were going to excise the corruption within the Hero Public Safety Commission fully and completely without causing any havoc to the still healing wounds left by the Liberation Front's rampages, they would need to do so absolutely flawlessly. Fortunately, Nisa had connections across Japan, including a particularly fearsome judge on the Supreme Court who could help get them onto the schedule for trial. And of course, he naturally had access to the most skillful lawyers in the country, by virtue of the fact that UA was as a school that taught and employed pro-heroes. Almost all UA alumni were willing to do a favor for the principal of their alma mater, loaning their finest legal experts out to the school to help prep the case against the HPSC. With the resources at his fingertips, combined with the collective resources of the Shigaraki Brotherhood, he had been able to assemble a crack team capable of devising a truly unstoppable plan. One of the more exhausting parts of this process had been the simplest. Midoriya had sent them a tape filled with his own personal observations on the case. Of course, given that he had high specs and IQ along with an industrial-level concentrated tea brewer, this meant that his observations were almost certainly right. What had taken so much of their time was parsing through it, and checking it from every possible angle to make sure that it was both entirely legal and completely feasible. Analyzing that single 10-minute recording had taken 50 experts in Japanese law a week, but in the end, it was worth it. They had come up with at the very least the bare bones of a plan to take them down. Naturally, not everything would be planned out in advance. After all, no plan survives contact with the enemy. They would need to develop various contingencies to ensure that no scenario remained unaddressed. When exactly Endeavor would reveal the extent of his crimes and the Commission having known about it was something that was not consistent, varying according to specific conditions. One thing that most certainly was not going to be revealed until after the commission was cleaned out was the entire saga of All for One and One for All, as well as the existence of mimicry. The origin of quirks, they had agreed, would not be revealed so long as Midoriya lived, as that would drive the people beyond obsession and into literal hero worship. But soon enough, the fact that All Might and Deku had been effectively quirkless for the first 14 years of their life would be revealed. They would not quite reveal the existence of One for All, but they would hint at the existence of a transferable quirk, which perhaps awoke All Might's legendary power. However it happened, ultimately they would guide the future along a better course, where the ones intended to police the heroes would be held to the same laws as everyone else. Skeptic sighed to himself. It had been easy, in hindsight, to put everything together. The immense power displayed by Midoriya, the way they had been so thoroughly outplayed, it was a confluence of immensely critical factors that none of them had connected together. From the Grand Commander in All for One, he had learned the essentials of the two powerful quirks and legacies which led them to clash at Kamino. And from the double of the Doctor, he had learned of Midoriya's lineage as a descendant of All for One in addition to his status as All Might's successor, as well as his suspicions regarding the boy's original quirk. Those two things had been the easy part. The more difficult part was in ascertaining the specific quirk that Midoriya had been born with. But eventually, Garaki had mentioned offhandedly that Toga was also a granddaughter of All for One, along with several heroes and villains he had been able to find. And while it had been difficult to ascertain the specific pattern, he had been able to find it. All for One passed down either a mutated version of his own quirk, or a copy of a stolen quirk. Himiko's mother possessed an antigen-swapping quirk, an ability All for One was known to have, while her father possessed a feline mutation quirk. The two had combined, with the DNA that was originally from All for One retaining the potential for replication of quirks while transformed, something that her awakening brought to the surface. After that, it had been easy for him to assume that Midoriya had a form of copying quirk which had been empowered by One for All. And given the fact that Niza had suddenly developed the odd habit of negotiating for the hairs of certain individuals with powerful quirks not long after their raid on the Hasaikai, he could easily assume that it was triggered through contact with DNA, specifically hair. He had been stunned for a moment as he realized that one 15-going-on-16-year-old had possessed not only both All for One and One for All, but the quirks of Stain, Overhaul and Kurogyri at the very least. For a moment, he had considered turning himself in, given how outspoken he seemed to be about human rights. He was mightiest without a doubt, and the doctrine of liberation dictated that might made right. Compared to most heroes, and especially to his grandfather, he seemed like a better person to live under the rule of. But soon enough, he had been able to shake himself. Heroes always talked a big game, but they rarely did much to help the real social ills that the world faced. And in his experience, it was only those who fought for the cause of liberation who did so. The rest were little more than money worshippers or enemies of Destro's will. So he had sent a letter to the Hero Commission outlining what he knew and suspected, hoping that they would focus their attention on the boy and Yue instead of him. After all, he had greater things to worry about for the moment. His escape had been somewhat difficult to pull off. The speedster had put him into restraints, careful to keep him away from any objects that Anthropomorph could work on. But fortunately for Twamatsu, this awareness about his quirk had not extended to the sidekicks who had come to ferry him off to the hero's temporary holding facility. He had been chained to a filing cabinet on the truck he had been in, and that turned out to be solidly within the size range of his quirk for him to be able to use it. It had been easy to take control of the truck and make his escape, while the heroes were still focused on dealing with All for One and the Grand Commander no Shigaraki, he thought to himself venomously. Shigaraki had had the chance to bring liberation, and he had failed. Skeptic had believed in the destiny of Redestro for some time, but knowing that he wasn't able to defeat Shigaraki, who had been defeated in turn by the heroes, he wasn't about to start backing the failed descendant of Destro again. So he had decided that for the moment, it was up to him to bring Destro's will to fruition, with the others disgraced and imprisoned. Of course, with his many talents, he had the means to do so. Despite the fact that a treaty from over 200 years ago prohibited the launching of weapons into space, there were still a number of weapons at his disposal. After all, if he was careful when deorbiting one of the many satellites surrounding the Earth, he could precision strike a specific set of coordinates. Though perhaps such an obvious solution to his problems was not the way to go. After all, with his skills, it should be easy to flood the internet with malware directly from the satellites, allowing him to orchestrate catastrophes across the planet. The ⴅ Public Safety Commission had watched the situation in Japan continue to unfold. True, their society was recovering well from the scars of war, but certain undesirable elements were trying to change this society. This was something that the Commission could not permit to happen, as the system they had so carefully designed and cultivated during the first decades after the dawn of quirks had been made to keep their vision for society in place. It may be less than ethical, but it kept the public safe enough to lead normal lives while the less desirable elements were occupied battling against each other for supremacy. They had allowed for approved mercenaries to work as government contractors licensed to protect the public from criminals, even allowing them to use their quirks. The shift from unapproved vigilantes to approved heroes was a deliberate move by the Japanese government, as their nation was apparently the source and origin of these new miraculous abilities. Enforcing a comic book paradigm of heroes and villains worked to restrict the way that the citizens thought about morality, which would keep them placid and docile enough to not think about using their powers without the approval of the government. Only the worst criminals would dare to use their abilities, for fear of being branded a villain and thus suffering harsher sentences. This was the mandate of the Japanese ⴅ Public Safety Commission. When it had been formally created as part of the legislation that made it possible for vigilantes to be hired by the government, these were some of the primary concerns of the politicians in charge. Their mission was to restrict the people's ability to use their powers in order to restrict the damage that they could do. And while that mandate had been created in a time when quirks were rare, it had not changed, only growing and expanding. Effectively, despite the immense change caused by the spontaneous evolution of the human race, society was almost entirely the same as it had been. And this was how the Commission preferred things to be. After all, if the freedom to use one's own natural powers was granted, even on a limited basis, to everyone, then there would be far too much change in such a short period. Society could collapse and humanity could be destroyed over petty grudges. So even though they knew what they did was unethical, they continued their political corruption of Japan, convinced that what they were doing was for the greater good. The undesirable elements that the Commission was currently worried about were of course a few distinct groups. Both the Creature Rejection Clan and the Inhuman Supremacy Party had been in a gang war across Japan ever since the defeat of Tamura Shigaraki, with the ISP using the rhetoric of his lieutenant Shuichi Iguchi, better known as the Reptilian Spinner. Of course, that was of minor importance compared to their long-term nemesis of sorts in Niza. The principal of Yue, along with his staff, was being an irritant as per usual. Though things were most certainly different now that they had full context. According to Spinner, Izuku Midoriya possessed the ability to permanently replicate quirks, which has served him well as the successor of All Might himself. The boy was thoroughly intelligent and highly talented. But by far the most interesting part about Midoriya was the fact that One for All had strengthened his birth quirk. Spinner had given 3 examples of quirks he had likely acquired, and with their resources, they were able to figure out most of the quirks he had at his disposal. And among those whose quirks he'd copied were All for One and his apprentice, meaning that he had All for One and Decay, along with every quirk that had been taken since the dawn of quirks. Combined with the revelation that Midoriya was a grandson of All for One himself, it was easy for them to figure out the most crucial of revelations. Izuku Midoriya was the most important piece on the board, and whoever held his allegiance would be able to shape the future of society for decades to come. Because as powerful as he was still just a boy. For all that he had preconceived notions of right and wrong, good and evil, he could still be nudged and raised in a particular way just like any other child. If All for One had known about his grandchild and been able to turn him into an ally, it would not have been difficult for the 2 brilliant men to trick All Might into passing on his quirk to Midoriya, creating a villain who could outstrip All for One or Tamura at their worst. This was their major issue, because while the path that he was treading was one that was certain to leave him as the undisputed #1 hero not just for the foreseeable future but for all of time, the fact still remained that he was under the direct tutelage of ᴡᴜ himself. That was not something that they could let happen if they were to remain in control over Japan. Of course, taking control of Midoriya would be difficult for them, as he and his family were currently living on UA's campus. They would need an inside man to help them get in, as well as a justification and a way to get rid of the influence and molding ᴡᴜ had used on their pawn. Fortunately, they had a mole within UA still. They had hoped to leverage the Aoyama's previous deal with All for One as a condition to keep them out of prison, but since he had been so crucial to ending the Paranormal Liberation War and tricking their leaders into meeting at a time and place of the hero's choosing, that information was public knowledge at this point. It was a good thing, then, that Nito Monoma of the oft-overlooked Class 2B was willing to work for them. After all, he and the rest of the second and third years would not be participating in the sports festival, which based on his psychological profile would really irritate his inferiority complex about his sister class. They sent a vaguely phrased request to their mole, and he arrived at the specified place and time, conferring with his handler. Phantom Thief seemed delighted to help out, though he made sure to ask again for protection. He was after all still a student in UA, and ᴡᴜ did not have a vicious reputation for no reason. Of course, they granted it, hashing out the beginnings of a plan to bring the Midoriyas into custody on suspicion of him being All for One's true successor who had manipulated everyone into believing he was a hero. Once they had him in their underground facility, they could get to the real work, manipulating and altering his memories and personality to be more in line with their own agenda. After all, they had access to certain procedures for memory manipulation and alteration. They would need to adapt them, of course, to ensure that overhaul, rewind and super regeneration didn't interfere, but in the end, he would be a tool to ensure that their vision for Japan remained unchallenged. Hopefully, this would take place relatively soon. The agents of the Commission had contacts within the Creature Rejection Clan and the Inhuman Supremacy Party, so they could easily arrange for a major spike in violence across Japan to keep ᴡᴜ occupied when they swooped in. It had taken Nito all of his training in acting and deception to be able to keep a straight face the whole time, but he had managed it. He now was a trusted mole within the Commission. And even though he wasn't high enough in rank, he had had the opportunity to execute one of ᴡᴜ's craftiest plans by bugging the entirety of Commission headquarters. All it had taken in the end was a single handshake with his handler in order to transfer the newest batch of nanites that Power Loader Sensei had developed. These were far more difficult to find, and a more than suitable replacement for the feather recorders that Hawks had used. At this point, Hawks was starting to wonder about whether or not the Commission was aware of his loyalty to UA, so this was a natural step to make sure that they would be able to have information on the Commission even if he was exposed and stripped of his clearance. And ᴡᴜ had mentioned that he was thinking of going solo, and no longer being an agent of the Commission, even if that would almost inevitably lead to an assassination attempt. These nanites were smaller, more durable and more difficult to find by most means. They were designed to use the Wi-Fi of the Commission's headquarters to establish an untraceable wireless connection, with heavy layers of encryption designed to frustrate even a mind as brilliant as ᴡᴜ's from decoding the message. And since they were impossible to find and disable, they would allow for an uninterrupted record of everything that happened in their proximity. Of course, all of this were but the least important features, the part that would allow for the information transfer. The real bulk of the design was the fact that they were able to self-replicate and spread, using materials such as rock, concrete, steel or fabric to create more of themselves and cover more and more of Commission headquarters. And the recording features were extensive, allowing them to record everything within 10 meters with video and audio, storing a maximum of 72 hours worth of recording before transmitting it in a singular burst and wiping its storage. The credit for all of these insane innovations was of course given to Hatsum and Midoriya. May had taken some of the mechanical designs he had thought up during his long exile and used them to improve the nanobots that had been used to track the Liberation Front and the recording feathers that Hawks had been using. This had naturally reaped some major rewards, as within 6 hours, they had a working floor plan of the compound in its entirety. Even if they hadn't trusted Nito, the agents of the Commission definitely trusted each other, allowing them to use the ultimate form of social engineering to bug the compound and gather more dirt against the organization. He grinned to himself out of pride. By keeping up the charade of being a mole within Yu now had absolutely every conceivable bit of data they could ever need in order to take down the Hero Commission. Though he did grimace slightly as he realized just how much more work it would put on the shoulders of the legal team. And they were so close to perfecting their airtight legal case, too. Nizu was smiling in a horrible and foul way, a kind of smile that he never showed to any of his teachers. They were, after all, terrified of his normal smile, to say nothing of his "I'm going to cause chaos" smile. But this smile was as bad if not worse than All for One's. The symbol of evil's smile had been terrifying because of his sheer menacing presence, but he had at least had the advantage of a perfectly normal smile. Nizu, by contrast, had a thoroughly sadistic grin on his face as he savored the thought of what he was going to inflict upon the Hero Commission. And it looked all the more terrifying because of the subtle ways that it simply looked wrong on him because he wasn't human. But no one was here, not even Midoriya, so he was not worried, indulging himself in a rare moment where he could indulge in his hatred of the Commission. He knew, of course, that they were going to try and distract Yue a month after the sports festival. Which was exactly why he was going to catch them off guard by having Endeavor confess to his crimes right after the sports festival and step down. Then, when he became the de facto number one, Hawks would declare his resignation from the Commission and officially join their side for good. That would keep them off guard just long enough for them to be able to prepare for an attack at the specified time so that they could anticipate and counter the kidnapping before dragging them to court. Of course, the transcripts of the court session would be destroyed. After all, the existence of One for All and everything else related to Izuku Midoriya's immense importance to the world as a whole would need to be kept quiet. But nonetheless, his legal team could promise that they would be able to schedule a closed-record trial to be convened the day after the Commission's attempt to kidnap Midoriya, keeping them out of the loop until mere hours before the trial was set to begin. A trial that they were certain to win, as they had done everything they could to ensure a swift legal judgment before the Supreme Court except bribery. With mere hours to prepare before defense, they would have no legal avenue of evading judgment. And since the case would be brought before the Japanese Supreme Court, they would have no recourse for appeal, and no way to avoid their punishment. The outcome of the trial would naturally be headline news, and that would begin the second stage of their plan. Yagi and Yamada had already laid the groundwork by building subtle anti-commission sentiment. Learning the full extent of their crimes would whip the citizens into a frenzy, and the politicians would be forced to address this injustice if they wanted to keep or gain power. As far as political change was concerned, this part of the plan was simple, but unstoppable given the amount of evidence and testimony they had about their misdeeds. Though they would need to find a legal justification for their espionage of a government agency in the first place. After all, heroes worked for the government as public servants. Their permission to surveil was limited to suspected criminals outside of the government, with only the Public Security Intelligence Agency permitted to look into internal affairs such as government corruption. And since many of the members of the Public Security Examination Commission were also members of the Hero Public Safety Commission, it was impossible for them to discover anything through that route. Exposing that would be their primary justification, and the thrust of their argument would be a certain phrase that Midoriya had coined that had become common thanks to All Might's usage of it. Meddling when you don't need to is the essence of being a hero. Nizu watched the sunset, secure in the knowledge that someday soon, the ones who had experimented on him would receive horrible, bloody vengeance. It was not exactly a heroic thought, but one he enjoyed deeply.